Jennifer, could you introduce yourself and then briefly tell us a bit about your career path to date?
Yes, will do. Thank you. I'm Dr. Jennifer Harris. I work at the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry, and I'm the Director of Research Policy there. And my research career to date has been a bit mixed. I come from a biomedical science background, so I did my undergraduate in biomedical science at the University of Plymouth, and then did a full-time research master's and PhD, which means that I did a program that didn't include lectures. So it was just full-time at the bench doing lab work for both my MPhil and my PhD at the University of Cambridge. And that was in medical science as well. And I majored in oncology, so cancer.
Excellent.
From that point onwards, I was able to do a secondment at the Department of Health and Social Care after my PhD, and that was timed towards the end. I know that students often do it in their second year or during their PhD, but I did mine at the end. So that sat between me kind of finishing my lab work and finalising my PhD to starting at the ABPI. So I did a short stint there too.
Excellent. So can you tell us what is your day-to-day job now, and can you tell us a bit about what your role involves and perhaps a bit about how you use your scientific background in your job as well?
Yeah, so just to start with what the organisation does that I work with at the moment. So they are the UK's trade association for the pharmaceutical industry. So they represent pharmaceutical companies of many shapes and sizes, both national and international, who are actively doing research and development in the UK. We ensure that the environment for the UK is optimal for pharmaceutical R&D. So that's everything from discovery research, drug discovery, through to translational research, clinical trials, the regulatory environment, and also the commercial environment to support uptake and access of those new medicines and therefore delivery to patients. So it's quite a broad policy landscape that we work across. We would call it life sciences. So you might see that written around in terms of the term of the sector that we're in. And in terms of the kind of day-to-day, because we are working on the environment for which our companies operate in and the broader life sciences ecosystem, there is a lot of engagement with stakeholders and with UK government, as well as international stakeholders and international bodies which represent governments, etc. So what that practically means is that we do a lot of meetings. We have a lot of cross-functional discussions, workshops, conferences, events, deep dives into certain topics and things. And what we're looking for is a conversation and a consensus across the sector as to what is currently working well, what isn't currently working well, and therefore how can we improve it. And once we've all reached a consensus as to what needs to be improved, the biggest challenge is then how do you actually improve it? What policy initiative are you going to go forth with to support the improvement of that ecosystem? So take the example of clinical trials. You might say, well, we have acknowledged that we could probably recruit more people from a diverse background into clinical trials. At the moment, we have a challenge with that, and COVID-19 has amplified that. So then, in terms of having identified that problem, what then do you do next? So then you need to start talking to regulators, talking to the NHS, talking to research sponsors, talking to the government, and say, okay, if we all agree this is the challenge, how are we going to fix that? And there's never ever a silver bullet to these things. You need to have a multi-pronged approach to fixing any public policy issue. So it's quite interesting in that sense because it forces you to get consensus across stakeholders. It sometimes can be a really quick process. People that automatically identify that we need to put more funding into this or this or whichever other policy initiative, and others are a bit harder nuts to crack, which then means that you have to spend a lot of time kind of means testing that policy, those policy options, and say, okay, if we were to do this, what are the unintended consequences, etc. So there's a lot of thinking about the policy initiatives and the environment in which that policy initiative would be implemented. And then in terms of where the science comes in, because it is about life sciences, and for my role in particular, research and development, knowing already how bits of the system work is really helpful in being able to identify the problem and identify potential solutions. So if we were to talk about improving entrepreneurship in PhD students, or the talent pipeline, or we want to talk about how research councils funded translational research. Me, with my experience in the biomedical research environment, means that I'm bringing some competency and experience in that space already. Now, the good thing about policy, and what I enjoy about policy, is that I'm never going to fix it on my own, and my experience is never going to be sufficient. So that's why it's important to then pull, different people in from different parts of the system. And everybody has a different background and a slightly different story, and brings a slightly different nuance to the equation. So that's what's enjoyable about it. You are kind of permanently learning, and as somebody who enjoys a challenge, it's nice, because there's no day that is the same. One day you might be writing a policy report, or working on planning a workshop, or having a one-to-one conversation with an international pharmaceutical company, or having a conversation with a patient group, or having preparing for the chief executive to have a meeting with the Secretary of State, or the Prime Minister, as we had over the summer. So there's a huge diversity in it, and I think that keeps you on your toes. There's obviously reactive things that happen. You can't plan everything to within an inch of its life. For example, when the pandemic hit, we obviously had business plans and objectives for that year that we wanted to deliver on, and the pandemic completely flipped that on its head, because we do have to be responsive to the health and life sciences system. So it does keep you on your toes, and I think that balance between doing a bit of proactive work and reactive work suits some people. It doesn't suit everybody. Some people prefer something that they can project manage entirely, and some people prefer being 100% in reactive mode. But I quite like the balance. So that's where my expertise comes in. That's what I do on a day-to-day. That's kind of what the ABPI is all about.
Excellent, thank you. It all sounds really exciting, and like a really interesting role that you have, and the opportunity to speak to so many different people must be really, really fascinating as well. You mentioned you're now the director of policy. So where did your career start, and how has it progressed since you started?
Yep. So when I was younger, I thought I wanted to become a medic, because you like biology and you enjoy the idea of learning about diseases and the organs and how a body works and things. So you instinctively just go, well, you need to become a doctor. That's a clinical doctor, that is. And I did some ward training, and realised I didn't really like working in the ward. I didn't really like the job of a clinician nor a surgeon. So you then go, okay, well, my interest in the subject area hasn't changed, just that career is not right for me. So then I went down the biomedical science route, and normally that trains you to become a biomedical scientist in a hospital. And I did some work experience there, and didn't like being in the labs in the hospitals either. So then you go down the research route, because you think, well, that gives you that intellectual freedom to explore ideas and contribute to the success of biomedical research holistically. And I did my master's and my PhD, and I did research, summer research programs, and I did secondments at Oxford, I did secondments in Italy. And I probably could have gone down the postdoc route. But about halfway through my PhD program, I realised that I didn't want to become a PI. I didn't really want to just be in academia. I could do it, but it wasn't 100% for me. I didn't jump out of bed every morning thinking to myself, I absolutely love this. It was really enjoyable. I did enjoy my PhD. I had a good PhD program, and I was really blessed to have the opportunity across my education to do secondments and to do internships and things, and they've all added to my growth, absolutely. But it just wasn't 100% for me. I had been doing a lot of outreach, kind of public outreach and science communication along the side, as I think a lot of PhD students in the life sciences will do, science fairs and supporting local festivals and that kind of thing. And that was fine, and I enjoyed that kind of public dialogue, I suppose. And once I went to a conference in London on, it's going to sound a bit peculiar, but minimum unit alcohol pricing for alcohol. And it was a public policy question, you know, should we be making alcohol a certain price in order to prevent alcoholism and negative side effects of that and the impact it has on public health? And it was a conference in London. It was within the Royal Society building. I think I went in my first year of my PhD, and it was the first time I'd been to a policy conference. And it kind of sparked this interest in me. I thought, well, this is brilliant. Look at all of the different perspectives that are coming around the table to talk about this single policy problem. You know, it's a proposal for a policy intervention. Let's go into that. So I then started building up some kind of extracurricular activities along the side of my PhD to get me into the policy world and to get myself thinking in that way and more savvy in that way, because it is a different way of thinking versus the PhD. It's a lot more complex, I think, in some instances, because you have to think about all these different stakeholder perspectives. So I did that, and then because I was funded by the Medical Research Council, they were able to support the funding of a secondment. The Cabinet Office often do secondments for PhD students, as do the UKRI with the Research Council students, so BBSRC, MRC. I was funded by MRC, and an opportunity came up via the Cabinet Office to do a secondment. Now, doing my secondment in the middle of my PhD would have been problematic, simply because I was doing a lot of in vivo work at the time. So the idea came about that I would do it at the end of my PhD program, which is a bit unprecedented, but worked a lot better for my PI, a lot better for me. And the timings worked fine for the Department of Health, who would be the recipient of me as an extra pair of hands for that secondment. And the additional barrier was that a secondment is normally for 3 months, but DH were requesting 6 months. So for me, it was kind of a once in a decade opportunity to get a 6th month secondment at the Department of Health. It was going to be working on mental health, which at the time was a Theresa May's baby. You know, it was a huge government agenda, mental health. And the idea of passing that up, I think, I just couldn't imagine passing that up. You know, they wanted me to join the team. The project was only for a year, and I would be there for 6 months. So you would see the entire policy process in like a condensed form. So you'd be really hands-on. It was a small team. And you know, Jeremy Hunt, the Secretary of State for Health at the time, was really close to it and working very closely with the team. And you know, there's not many opportunities like that come up. You just have to try and work really hard to grab them with both hands and convince people that it's the right opportunity for you. So yes, you have to write and, you know, go out proposals and things and to justify the costs and to make sure that the exception of it being 3 months and then going to 6 would be supportive. And MRC and the local Cambridge teams were really helpful in supporting me in all of that. And yes, I went ahead and did it, and it was the experience that got me my current job, because I wouldn't have got a job at ABPI or with anybody in policy for that matter, I don't think, at the level that I was at without that experience. Don't get me wrong, many people do. There are individuals that do a bit of policy work or very little work experience and can land an entry-level policy role. It is possible. But for this particular role, because ABPI was a small organisation, they were looking for somebody to come in and hit the ground running a little bit, and for somebody to work basically within a team of 2 to do the entire R&D policy work. So you didn't have a lot of people around you to support you in those early development days. And they were looking for somebody with a PhD in life sciences, medical sciences, and they were looking for somebody who was just a little bit more experienced. So I came in as a policy executive in the ABPI, and I was interviewing at the time for policy manager roles and that kind of thing. So I did enter perhaps, you know, one prong higher up than perhaps that someone with no experience would. And from that point, I've just kind of gone from strength to strength, really. I made policy manager a couple of years ago. I made head last year, and now I'm taking on director. It's a bit of a ridiculously fast whirlwind through the ranks. But the one thing that I realised about myself is that I like connecting the dots. I like problem solving, and that in business terms is sometimes called strategy. You know, planning. Yeah, you can understand what the ecosystem's about. You know what needs to be done. You can coordinate things to do that. You can connect the dots. You can make it happen, and that's something that is a skill for those that are a bit higher up in an organisation, because you then get that responsibility of needing to strategically drive what the organisation does in that policy area. And when I compare it and I look back to what I was doing in my PhD, it is such a significant evolution. It's just very different, isn't it? And each one of those steps were really crucial in me being able to get to where I've got to.
Excellent. It sounds like you've identified that the thing you really enjoyed was problem solving, but it was finding the right kind of problem
solving. Yes, problem solving
on.
within life sciences. It's a niche.
Yeah, that is something that many of our students come to us and say, I really enjoy problem solving, but not in perhaps the academic research environment, but I just don't know what it looks like in other areas. And when you find the problems that you're really enthusiastic about and the way of doing it that works for you, it sounds like for you it's really turned out to be a really positive step, because you found the types of problems you want to work on and the way of doing it and the right environment for you.
Absolutely. And this is what I hope people are hearing from my recollection of everything I've done in the past 10-15 years is it is a bit trial and error, because it is. I've tried stuff and it didn't work for whatever reason. I've tried to hone in on the thing that I like. One of the things that did help whilst I was at Cambridge was myself and a few other PhD students who were quite interested in exploring other careers set up a graduate forum based out of Addenbrooke's, and we brought external speakers into the research environment to speak to postdocs and PhD students to say, this is what day-to-day looks like, and this is what, try and get people who are just into it as well, versus people who are a bit further up the ranks, and a right mixture so that people get a good sense of working in policy and just being able to see that breadth as well, and talk to people who have either done different things. I had a friend who was working in venture capital, who did a bit of experience in venture capital, just being able to peruse that and explore it and go, actually, that thing's not for me and that thing's not for me. Sometimes people feel quite defeated when they realise something's not for them, but it doesn't mean there isn't something for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's always worth reflecting on why something isn't for you, so you know what the opposite might be, or you can start thinking, okay, this is why it's not for me, but what does that mean I do want? And sometimes you can turn it around a little bit to find some criteria to help you with the next
Absolutely
step.
Absolutely.
So you worked briefly for the Department for Health and Social Care before moving to the ABPI, and I think lots of our students are very familiar with the civil service and Department for Health and Social Care. How does working at the ABPI perhaps differ from that experience? What kind of stands out to you?
So I've spoken to many people who are interested in going into policy, and they immediately think that you kind of have to work for government. You have to work in the civil service, and the civil service and the way and what they value is sometimes a bit different to what people are used to in academia. So that transition can sometimes be quite difficult unless you've done, the fast streamer program in civil service, or unless you've had a secondment or you've got some way in. It's quite difficult to get into the civil service. Once you're in, it's a lot easier. That's one key difference. One key difference is, does the employer value the skill set you currently have? And when you're doing that initial transition period, sometimes it's a bit harder to get in than in other areas. I mean, I'll admit that I interviewed for civil service jobs whilst I was interviewing for ABPI, and they turned me down at interview stage. So I didn't even get to interview stage with the department. So there are failures in all of this as well. So I think that's the first key difference is are you going to be engaging and working with people that are of a similar background to you? And when I interviewed at ABPI, what I noticed is everybody there has either worked in a pharma company or in some other part of the life sciences sector, or has a PhD in a biomedical science background. So I'm working with similar people. So you always kind of keep a lookout for that difference in the people that you're working with, because I think that matters as well. The other thing is what's driving the day-to-day. So in the civil service, the thing that's driving the day-to-day is the government agenda, is the strategic direction of travel for that particular area. So within the Department of Health and the Office for Life Sciences at the moment, a critical area is the life sciences vision, which is a policy strategy for the entire life sciences sector. So if you're a civil servant working in those areas, there is this ministerial government kind of agenda that you are helping to implement and work towards. Now, that's then going to be the case for everybody in the environment who's a stakeholder, such as ABPI, because we're helping government to deliver that by providing an industry perspective on what would work and what initiatives would work, and making sure that that delivers on the objectives of what it is originally set out to do. The only difference is that if everything changes tomorrow in terms of government personnel, we're not impacted by that per se, other than needing to then reroute our kind of advocacy around who's in charge. Whereas from a civil servant's perspective, they might turn around and say, well, that thing that you've been working on is gone now. Like we're not interested in that. So can you change tact? So it has to be a lot more agile because it's been based entirely on the pressures of the government at the time. If you just look at what happened in the civil service in the pandemic, a lot of stuff pivoted towards the pandemic. So if you then look at the ABPI, because we are a membership organisation, our primary driver is going to be our member companies, pharmaceutical companies who want to do life sciences R&D in a particular country. And we are there to serve our members, but ultimately pay our salaries at the end of the day. Yes, we have to work within the confines of the environment and within the confines of what government would like to do or would not like to do, but it allows us to still advocate for something government is not currently doing. So it all depends on kind of what drives you, really. Some people would prefer that perhaps the government model, and others not. So just to be aware that there's always a higher master somewhere, and the question is, which higher master do you want to serve?
Yeah, I guess it's that values-driven approach of which one fits best with your values and what's important to you. And it comes back to that problem solving. Which problems do you want to work on? Which issues do you want to work on?
Absolutely.
And where do you want them to be coming from? Is it the pharmaceutical industry? Is it the government's plans? Some combination. I mean, they're all interlinked at the end of the day, but who you're perhaps aligning yourself with could be quite important, and that might determine which organizations are a better fit and give you the work you want to do.
Absolutely. And the other thing to bear in mind as well is that the civil service is the UK, of course, right? And some people may have identified that, for example, they really like global health. So if they want to work on global health, where's the best place to do that? And it might not be the civil service, because actually you might think that the WHO is the best place to go. And if you so it's all about, there's that international dynamic as well, because particularly in health policy, we're talking about the patients, we're talking about public health in the broadest sense. If we're talking about cancer research in the UK, I guarantee you there'll be similar conversations happening in the US or in Spain about cancer research. So the actual fundamental underlying, the commonality between all of this is the global patient. And then the question is, would you prefer to work in one particular operating environment or another? Through my policy work, I've realised that perhaps, whereas initially I thought I would love to work for the EU Commission, I've now realised that there are bits of it that I would like to work in and bits of it that I wouldn't like to work in. And then I've never even dreamed of working in an international environment or working with a US trade association, but now I have, and some bits of that are good and some bits of it aren't. So I think you've just got to constantly be quite reflective about what it is that you want to really get your teeth stuck into, and what works for you in terms of a kind of a day-to-day.
Yeah, I think that's really, really good advice. Reflect on what works for you and think about what's going to work for you, because everyone's an individual at the end of the day, and different things are better for different people. So really fantastic advice there.
And there's no immediate correct path through either. And it's not like, you're either non-civil service or civil service. I've seen so many people move between the two. It's harder when you're earlier on, but once you're established, like, it's quite easy to flit about between different parts of the sector. So also, as much as I say, constantly be reflective and try to make the right decision, it's okay to make the wrong decision and then realize it doesn't work for you, and that's a learning experience, and then you move on, and your experience is going to be valid within the sector, period.
Yeah, I think that's really reassuring for people who are starting to explore this as a career path and are not quite sure where they might fit, or
give something a go.
Give it a try, see what works. And if it doesn't mean policy is the wrong career for you. It might just be a different organization or with a different focus. That may be more motivating and more positive than perhaps where you initially start out. So really good advice for people that once you're in, it doesn't mean you're stuck on that one path.
Absolutely. And there's all, and because, and again, when you first go into an organization, do try and poke around and try and understand what the opportunities for challenge and learning are, because if you're in an organization where actually it's incredibly hierarchical, and when you come in, you're going to be working on this one thing over here, and actually it's going to take you ages before you even get up to a point where you're going to be actually seeing a lot more, you might then realize that that's not particularly what you want to do. You would rather get flung into the deep end, go look at all the stuff that's happening, like grasp what works for you. So and there are different cultures and different ways of looking at that. And I think one of the key things to look out for is whether or not it's a big organization versus a small organization. I've always really favored smaller groups. Even when I chose my PhD and MPhil laboratory, when I was then looking for a job, I had the option between a bigger organisation and the ABPI, and I chose ABPI because the scope for learning in the early days was going to be much, much greater. So bear that in mind a little bit as well. Like, yes, try everything, but bear in mind whether or not you want to be in a position where you're a bit more constrained in the first instance.
Yeah, that's some really good advice, because there's so many different types of organisation, and what works for one person might be another just not going to be a good fit. So that's really good. Can you tell us a bit about different factors that influence your role, and perhaps how your role might change in the future as a result of some of those things?
So I think the good thing about policy is that you'll never not need policy. You're always going to need policy. Governments are always going to need policy advisors. They're by and large going to want to work within the ecosystem that they're trying to implement change in order to implement said change. So I think in terms of what is going to change my role, I think in principle, technically nothing. I mean, you could do a life sciences policy role for life, of course, and be working on just different challenges throughout your career. So it may be the case that certainly over the time, even just the 3.5 years that I've been at ABPI, what drove me and what drove us, and the thing that was really, really front of our minds, and everybody was working on it when I first joined, was of course Brexit and the end of transition with the EU. And then that happened. And you then don't really spend a lot of time working on Brexit and end of transition anymore. Yes, you're still working on some of the spillover challenges, but you're not working on that anymore, and you've shifted into a different gear, and you've got a different environment to work in now because we're no longer part of the EU. So then the type of policy work that you do shifts a little bit. Maybe you're not so EU focused anymore. Maybe you're more global focused. So these are all the things that have been happening at ABPI recently, and that obviously changes the type of policy work that you do. But it doesn't fundamentally change really the role. I think the only other thing to, I suppose, bear in mind is that regardless what organisation you're going to be in, whether it's policy or not, organisations tend to want to be agile. They tend to want to say, well, we're going to have a system reorganisation. We're going to change the headcounts. We're going to change what roles do what and whatnot, and you just have to be open to that. It doesn't work for everybody, and obviously redundancy is a terrible thing for some and a wonderful opportunity for others, but things move around. So don't think that when you move into a role, that's you single track for the rest of your life. There will likely be some fluxes and changes because every organisation refreshes their strategy and refreshes their organograms and governance structures. And, it might mean that you are then not in a position to do the same role in a few years' time as you are now. And I think what that then teaches you, and just if you've got that in your mind, not on a daily basis, it's not like a fear factor thing, but if you've got that in mind, you should then make sure that you've got a plan B. So what is your plan B? And within life sciences policy, what's quite helpful is that people do flux and move. Someone was at a company and then they went into the charity sector and then they went into the civil service and they popped out and went into a trade association. There is a fair bit of movement. So the beauty, I think, of policy and the fact that we permanently work with so many people across the system is that you're constantly getting exposure to those potentially different careers and different jobs and things. It sounds horrible to say always have a plan B in mind, but I think that the harsh reality of anything other than tenureship in academia is that someone might pull the plug one day. So don't get too comfortable is perhaps my cautious advice.
Yeah, I think, and to put it in a positive way, it's use your network to understand what's out there, so that in the event you choose to make a change, you want to, or there's a pressure that means you have to, you've got a sense of what's out there, what's on the horizon, and what you might need to make that change. So it makes it much more straightforward, hopefully. And you can navigate that perhaps a little bit more confidently without having to start right from scratch at that point where that change might need to happen. And
I think there's a huge amount of value in horizontal movements and things, and changing tact and being aware of what your translational skills are, so that if there is a change, be that enforced by you or enforced by something else, you can do that sideways movement or upward movement, you get somewhere else.
Excellent. So you mentioned earlier on that during your time at Cambridge, you were involved in a few extracurricular activities that helped you to explore a policy career further. Can you tell us a bit about what some of those were and how they supported you with your kind of career choice?
Yep. So there was a couple of ones. So I did a short project with the Cambridge Consulting Network. I probably got the name wrong, but that was quite helpful in interacting with different students from different parts of the system who were doing completely different degrees and different research projects and things, and starting to get a bit of a sense of what outside academia looks like. That was quite helpful, and also helped me realise that I don't necessarily want to become a consultant. So that was, again, another negative but very helpful one. Hugely of value was the Centre for Science Policy in Cambridge, and the student organisation accompanying that, CUSP. I probably spent, probably at some points during my PhD, more times with them doing workshops and attending their events and work after hours events and meetings, and opportunities to network with policy folk and hear from policy people who are already in the system. And all of that was just so helpful, because it was stuff like that got me hooked on it, and actually gave me, it challenged you, and it actually got you back into thinking about what policy actually is. Like, I've tried to describe that as much as I can here. What drives you in policy? Like, what drives policy? What do you need to think about? Who do you need around the table? Like, all of that kind of 101, I suppose, policy 101. CUSP and CSAP were incredibly helpful for, and they were also incredibly helpful for actually networking and building that policy network. Mm-hmm. I learned from all of that London was basically like the hub for policy. So if you wanted to work in life sciences policy, chances are you had to work in London. That was pre-COVID days. But nevertheless, government and Whitehall are in London. So, if you want to have a meeting with them in person, it's going to be in London. So I started learning kind of who the key players were. So then you're starting to prime yourself to who the potential employers are. So then you start understanding, okay, there's an Academy for Medical Sciences, there's the Wellcome Trust, there's a trade association, there's the Department for Health, the Department for Business, there's Go Science, there's, you start mapping out what that ecosystem looks like. There's the Royal Society, etc. And once you start doing that, you start, again, understanding where you could slot in. And just being able to have a frank conversation with somebody to say, you know, we've interacted over this workshop. Do you think I could make it in policy? And just being able to speak to somebody who is in policy or who engages with policymakers, and then being able to say, yeah, absolutely, you're not off the mark entirely. Like, you know, just, of course, you're not going to be an amazing policymaker and the most amazing policy advisor from day one, but just to get that encouragement and reinforcement from somebody who's there to say, yeah, I think you should definitely go for it. So those were just really invaluable conversations. And I think if I didn't have those during my PhD via those two organisations, I don't think I would have even pursued it further. I would have just seen it as like an extracurricular thing that I did. The other bit that I didn't quite realise at the time that I was doing, but then realised upon getting the job and having some feedback on my interview, was it gets you thinking outside of your PhD. You know, you cannot do public policy without being on top of current affairs. You know, what's happening in the health sector, what's happening in science and innovation, because they're going to ask you, because policy is policy, and you're not going to be doing policy on the thing that your PhD's on. So it gave you that, I think ABPI called it, like that worldliness, that, you know, slightly more peripheral awareness and thinking. So that was really helpful, and I maybe took that for granted a little bit to start with, but apparently it was the thing that was a distinguishing feature. The other organisation that's really good is, so Sense About Science do a kind of evidence transparency scoring programme. They've done a couple of reports in the past. They're always looking for volunteers to help them score government policies for evidence transparency. And again, it's, you know, it's something completely nothing to do with my PhD, but it got you reading government documents. It got you actually looking out for stuff that, you know, is it well-developed policy? And that in itself is a skill, because there are many people out there that think just because the minister says X, you have to do it. And actually, evidence-based policy making is absolutely what all of our chief scientific officers and chief medical officers are embedding across Whitehall. It's an approach I heavily endorse. So that was really helpful as well, because it just was something you did, you know, for an hour at the weekend or something, a little bit of something to do it during the week. And it's fascinating because you'd be reading about all kinds of different policies that government are working on, and that gets you into the routine of looking at things that are slightly beyond your immediate remit.
Yeah, it sounds really interesting. And I think that's, you know, good to hear that there's very flexible things that can fit in alongside what can be a very busy time when you're doing a PhD as well. And
absolutely.
Lots of different ways you can try things out without it being a humongous commitment if that's not going to work. So that's really good absolutely. For people to check out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, things like the British Science Association as well do bits of this, and, you know, usually some of these things that are more virtual and not like an in-person workshop or something, they are a lot easier to do virtually from anywhere, wherever you're based, whether it's Cambridge or not. But yeah, those two particular initiatives were very good. And the other thing that I've remembered is in addition to the policy transparency scoring work that Sense About Science do, Sense About Science also hold workshops as well. And one of the ones that I was able to go on, which was I think a day and a half workshop in Brussels, and it was all about EU policy. And that just opened up a whole other world to me. And I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. You know, international policy at its best. And that was just really valuable. And I think what was really nice there was that my PI was supportive to say, you know, go take a day off from lab work to do that, you know. So I think being honest with the PI about what you want to try and spend your time doing, and it's not just because it's some extracurricular thing to avoid going to the lab, it's something that's actually going to really support your career development, because it's something that you maybe want to do as a career post PhD, sometimes brings a bit more weight.
Yeah, that's a really good piece of advice, to really think about how you present it to your PI so they understand how it's going to have a positive impact on you at some point. That's really positive. So I think that leads us quite nicely onto whether you have any particular advice for PhD students or postdocs who are exploring a career change away from the academic research environment. Any pearls of wisdom you'd like to share?
I'd say just explore. You know, there are so many online events, workshops that are free, things that are really open. There's so many such student bursaries to go on events and things, welcome to policy summer schools. There's loads of stuff out there. And I think if you're open to it and you're taking a bit of time to explore it and not expecting it to land in your lap, then I think you'll find stuff that you didn't even realize existed, and, see where that takes you. So I think exploration is one of them. The second one, I think, is that reflection. Just think really, really hard about what makes you tick, and what you enjoy. And some people will say, well, I don't know because I've only been in a lab. But actually, if you look beneath the surface of the actual operational day-to-day, those translational skills and things that you do, maybe it's the case that you like reading the papers but not necessarily doing the pipetting, in which case maybe maybe you like understanding evidence and knowledge acquisition and that problem solving piece rather than practical stuff. I don't know. So just be self-reflective. And then the third bit is utilize your networks, I think. I guarantee you that people will know people who know people who know people who know people. And even if it's just, picking up the phone to a friend of a friend and saying, well, I've heard you do X, could you give me some insight as to what that's like? And people that work at organizations as well. It might not even be a friend of a friend. I was incredibly lucky to have this individual who looked at my CV, somebody who was recruiting policy people who could look at my CV and say, yes, it's really good. So it's obviously very valuable to have the Cambridge Career Service and to have that approach. But I think sometimes when you're in like a really niche area and it's like something that you're not really sure if having somebody who's in the thick of it, being able to say, here's a bit of advice, whether it's your CV or otherwise, is just really helpful. So don't be afraid. LinkedIn's always a very good thing to go via. Don't be afraid to connect with people and ask a question,
Yeah, that's really good advice, because we get lots and lots of students who say to us, I found this Cambridge alumni from my department or research group who's gone on to do X. Can I message them on LinkedIn? Yeah. And absolutely, that's a really good starting point. You've got something in common, so it's worth getting in touch. So really,
and the other thing also is that university alumni networks are vast, and people will have moved on to one thing immediately after, and then onwards and upwards and whatnot. And don't be afraid to use that, because I think it does allow conversations like this.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really a real positive to use those very keen people who've moved on from the university but are happy to help, because often people really are happy to give up, half an hour to give you some tips and insight. And then that will really help you to move forward with your career planning. And
absolutely,
really good advice. And finally, if there's a student out there who's interested in getting into policy work, is there any particular advice that you would give them for exploring or pursuing a career a bit like yours?
I would say for policy, I think perhaps in addition to the three that I just mentioned, it would be, do try and kind of get used to that world, be it reading, making sure you're up to speed on current affairs, be it reading policy documents. Government publish all of their policy documents. They're online. You can read them. Explore the .gov website. It will have so many policy documents there. Have a listen to PMQs on a Wednesday. Watch the Science and Tech Select Committee, or whichever select committee you're interested in. Have a listen about how policy is discussed, and just get used to that, because it's an awareness of that environment that is so critical. Because you could have absolutely the most smartest, most amazing academic with the most amazing peer-reviewed list of publications, but if they don't understand that environment, it's going to be harder to develop and make sure that policy actually lands in the environment and is successful. So just start familiarizing yourself with all of that. And if you find it very, very boring, then policy might not be for you. And if it piques your interest, then perhaps it's the right thing for you.
Some really great advice. Well, thank you very much, Jennifer, for taking the time to speak to us today. It's really, really helpful, and you've given some fantastic insights and tips and advice for our students. So thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for having me. Thank you, Cambridge.
Very, very welcome. Is there anything you'd like to add before we finish today?
I think probably on the advice bit, I know I said explore, and as part of explore, make sure that looking at summer schools and placements and secondments and those options, and the university will be open to having a conversation around how best to slot that into your program and whatnot. So there are avenues.
Yeah, that's really good.
We've got lots of avenues.
That's really good advice. Excellent. Oh, thank you very much.